On October 29th, 2022, the Itaewon district in Seoul, South Korea, was bracing itself for a night to remember. The subway station was packed, the bars and restaurants were overflowing onto the street, and a river of nearly 100,000 people flowed through the district, many of them dressed in costumes. The shadow of COVID had finally passed, and after 3 years of restrictions, Itaewon's famous Halloween festivities were finally back in full swing. By evening, however, the crowds were building up fast, flooding down the main strip and spilling into the small, winding alleyways that sprawl out across the area. And then, just after 10 p.m, disaster struck. One street in particular, a steep 40-metre-long alley next to the Hamilton Hotel, was just outside the subway station, completely jammed with bodies. As the crowd surged in different directions, all pushing against each other with nowhere to go, some people caught in the middle started to lose their footing. Some of them fell over, knocking others on the way down, and this started a domino effect of stumbles, falls, and pile-ups. That's when the screaming started. But they weren't the sounds of people having fun, the sounds instead of people being crushed to death. Most passers-by couldn't tell from the sheer number of people on the streets and the noise of the surrounding bars and clubs that the people in that alleyway were being suffocated, crushed, and trampled on. They were panicking and screaming out desperately for help. Within the crowd, people were begging each other to stay upright and not to fall over. Some clambered up the walls of the alley to escape the crowd. The unlucky ones, though, were pinned against the floor under the tangled mess of bodies. Meanwhile, people outside the alley were holding up their phones to capture the horror unfolding in real time. By the time that emergency workers finally arrived, it was too late. The crowd was so dense that nobody could get out and nobody else could get in. Lifeless bodies were soon being pulled from the crush. Paramedics, police, and partygoers in costumes were all performing CPR right there in the street, trying to resuscitate the unconscious. The dead were carefully covered in blankets. All the while, in some bars just meters away, the music kept playing. Many people were completely oblivious to the disaster unfolding around them. It was Halloween, after all. In total, nearly 160 people died that night in the crush. Most were young, in their teens and 20s, and 27 were foreign nationals. It was one of the worst disasters in South Korean history, and the largest mass casualty incident in Seoul since the Sampoong department store collapse of 1995. The authorities were quick to offer their condolences and promise support for the victims. The press, meanwhile, were quick to suspect the authorities were more responsible for the disaster than they were letting on. Maybe there was something more going on here than just a tragic accident. Maybe there was someone to blame. Seoul's Itaewon district got its reputation for nightlife from its days neighbouring the US military base Yongsan Garrison, which was set up all the way back in 1945. Over time, bars and brothels popped up to serve the American troops, and the area was soon considered dangerous for locals to visit. Like many rough nightlife areas, though, Itaewon was eventually gentrified about 20 years after the Korean War, and by 2018, when the US military finally moved its base to southern Seoul, the district had completely transformed. Today, Itaewon is one of the city's hottest nightlife spots, packed with trendy clubs, restaurants, and bars. And around 2010, something new started happening there. Halloween. What used to be a Western holiday suddenly exploded in popularity across Korea, and no place embraced it more than Itaewon. It played host to decorations, costume parties, and themed events at local bars and nightclubs. Take a trip to Itaewon though, or check it out on Google Maps, and you can see why it was so at risk of overcrowding. The area is made up almost entirely of tight, winding streets and alleys with almost no escape routes. And the alley at the centre of the disaster on October 29th is especially small. It's about 45 metres long and just over 3 metres wide at its narrowest point, which barely gives enough room for a few people to pass shoulder to shoulder. The alley also slopes uphill from the main road, Itaewon Road, which is home to Exit 1 of the Itaewon subway station and the Hamilton Hotel, two major landmarks in the area. In other words, it gets busy. And to make matters even worse, a temporary metal wall had been set up along one side of the alley on October 29th, and this was due to construction going on at the Hamilton Hotel. All of this reduced the space even more. So you get the picture by now, the alley was a death trap. You might be wondering though, how do you actually get trapped in a crowd crush like the one at Itaewon? Aren't there ways to escape? Well, when you get around 6 people per square metre in a crowd, their bodies are pressed together so tightly that they lose the ability to move or control where they go. At this point, the crowd starts to behave less like a group of people and more like a kind of fluid. Pressure waves can easily ripple through it and turn deadly in an instant. These compressive forces in large crowds, by the way, have been proven to be strong enough to bend steel railings. The main cause of death in a crowd crush is usually traumatic asphyxiation, and that's when the intense pressure on the chest and torso makes it impossible to breathe. The same pressure can block blood flow, causing swelling and bleeding, and even leave small hemorrhages in the eyes and upper body. Some people die standing upright until the force of the crowd finally pushes them to the ground. Others die by being trampled or crushed against walls and floors. On October 29th, in Itaewon, the victims were often those with the smallest bodies. Many were young or female. Survivors, meanwhile, say they were able to twist and shift their bodies to escape the worst of the pressure. And the district had the perfect conditions for a crowd crush that night. Eyewitnesses said you literally couldn't move even on the bigger streets. The first call to emergency services came in at 6:34 p.m. on October 29th. The caller warned that the alley next to the Hamilton Hotel was dangerously crowded and that a major accident could happen if people started falling over. Between then and 10 p.m, at least 79 emergency calls were made, some from people already being suffocated in the crowd. According to transcripts, one caller said, "That alley is very crowded with people going up and down. It's very unsafe. People can't come down, but they keep pushing up and it feels like a crush will happen. I barely got out, but the crowd is too large. You need to control it." Reuters reported that the last caller before the crush, who rang the police at 10:11 p.m, said, quote, "People will get crushed to death here. It's chaotic." According to the transcript, screams could even be heard over the phone. Eventually, the phone and internet service went down because so many people were trying to reach help at once. By this point, as the tragedy was unfolding, the streets outside were in chaos. There were so many people that ambulances and emergency workers could barely reach the alley. Instead, it was up to those inside the crowd, like 3 off-duty US soldiers, who escaped the crush by jumping onto a ledge and then helped pull people out to safety. One of these soldiers recalled that the crowd was at least 15 feet deep at its worst. Once out of the crush, there were so many victims that everyone was doing CPR. Anna, a Spanish partygoer who was there that night, told the BBC there were so many unconscious people that they needed normal people to do CPR. We had 2 friends who knew how to do CPR and they went out to help. 30 minutes later, they came back looking so traumatized and crying because they tried to save 5 or 6 people and they all died in my friend's hands. She added that, "I went out to help 2 girls. I don't know how to do CPR, but I was following the instructions of the people out there. They were telling me how to hold their heads and open their mouths and things like that. I was trying to help, but they were both dead as well. All the people they were bringing in to do CPR, most of them were already not breathing." Eventually, hundreds of emergency personnel were deployed to the scene, including all available first responders in Seoul and the US Army Military Police. Alerts were sent to phones in the area, urging people to return home immediately due to an emergency accident near Hamilton Hotel in Itaewon. Emergency workers had been pulling body after body out of the crushed tangle of limbs in the alley, and it was only past midnight, 2 hours after the crush began, that the alley was finally clear. In the days after the disaster, the South Korean government pledged its support for victims and their families and promised to review its safety guidelines for festival sites. On November 1st, the government pledged up to 15 million won, around $11,000, for funeral expenses of those killed, and 20 million won, or around $15,000, in compensation for their families. It also opened a one-stop support centre to help those affected, including funeral arrangements for victims, as well as providing cash assistance and psychological therapy. In the same breath, officials claimed that the overwhelming crowd couldn't have been predicted. The government even announced that it would use the term accident rather than disaster to describe the crush, to avoid tarnishing the district's reputation. But the authorities soon faced scrutiny. Within days of the disaster, Korea's National Police Agency launched a full investigation, and by January 2023, they confirmed what many people were already suspecting: poor planning, bad comms, and police mistakes had all played a role in the tragedy. Police raided several departments and city offices, uncovering that officers had ignored multiple emergency calls warning the alley was dangerously packed. The National Police Chief later confirmed that the Seoul station had received 11 emergency calls about overcrowding, starting more than 4 hours before the crush. But police told reporters that apparently only 4 of these calls were actually acted on. What's unclear is why these calls didn't lead to any further action, not until it was too late anyway. After all, the nearest fire station to the alley was just 660 feet away, and the nearest police station was even closer, just 330 feet. In the days following the incident, Interior Minister Lee Sang-min officially apologised, and National Police Chief Yoon Hee-kun admitted there were multiple reports to the police indicating the seriousness at the site just before the accident occurred. He added that police knew a large crowd had gathered even before the accident occurred, urgently indicating the danger. But that the way this information had been handled was, quote, inadequate. That wasn't enough for experts and families of the victims, who pointed even further back than October 29th and said that the authorities had plenty of opportunity to put proper crowd measures in place before Halloween. They pointed out that only 137 police officers were stationed in Itaewon that night. 6,000 officers, meanwhile, were assigned to a peaceful protest outside President Yoon Suk-yeol's office that same evening, and 1,300 were stationed at the concert of Korean boy band BTS earlier that month. It also turned out that dozens of plainclothes police officers had been deployed in Itaewon on October 29th too, but not for crowd control, just as part of a campaign against drugs. 4 days before Halloween, the local police station had apparently requested backup, knowing the crowds would be huge. But 2 days before the event, the official warning didn't mention anything about crowd safety. Instead, it was focused on theft, drugs, traffic, and general crime. Officers on duty said that they were told to only respond if crimes occurred. They'd be given no instructions about crowd control. The government later said it did not give police a crowd control plan that evening because the festivities had no official organiser. Some simply called this an excuse. Ha Kag-chon, a disaster prevention expert, later told the New York Times it's a basic duty of the authorities to make preparations and ensure safety when a large crowd is expected. Lee Jong-min, who lost a daughter in the crush, also told the New York Times, "One thing we learned in the past year is that no safety system matters unless you have a government with a sense of responsibility." And Young Uk Kim, an expert on crowd movement at Sejong University in Seoul, told the Washington Post, "If you just go assess the crush site and discuss potential countermeasures, anyone who has the instincts and experience would have been able to foresee the situation." The South Korean Firefighters Union even filed a complaint against the Interior Minister, arguing that the government couldn't dodge responsibility by claiming the event wasn't officially organised. And in the end, the fallout was pretty dramatic. A week after the incident, investigators also raided the Hamilton Hotel. They suspected the hotel had installed the metal wall in the alley without permission, and they were right. In the end, the owner of the hotel, who was identified by his surname Lee, was charged 8 million won, or just over $6,000, for violating building codes and putting up the illegal wall, which narrowed the width of the alley to little more than just 3 meters. And things continued to escalate from there. On November 11th, 2022, a Yongsan police officer who was being investigated for ordering the deletion of an internal crowd risk report took his own life. That same day, a Seoul city safety official was also found dead by his own hand. And in February 2024, 3 former police officers were convicted for destroying reports that showed police had ignored warnings about potential crowd accidents in Itaewon. This included former senior intelligence officer Park Seong-min, who was handed 18 months in prison for giving the order to destroy the document. Years later, the Halloween disaster continues to cast a shadow over South Korea. Studies 6 months after the disaster found that 37% of young adults, even those who hadn't witnessed the crush, suffered partial or full PTSD. And more than a year later, 1,316 firefighters were still receiving psychological treatment linked to the Itaewon disaster. Sadly, this wasn't enough for everyone. In July 2025, one of these firefighters, who'd been struggling with depression and PTSD from the disaster, died by his own hand. And a month later, the body of another firefighter was found beneath a bridge after being missing for 10 days. The firefighter, who was in his 30s, had been diagnosed with depression after the crush and had received therapy since. He even told the press shortly after the incident that moving bodies felt unbearable and that he kept thinking, "I hope this isn't real." All the while, people online were harshly criticising those who'd been in Itaewon the night of the disaster. Some called the district dangerous, dirty and strange, saying the crush was the people's own fault and even suggesting that they deserved it. They labelled the victims as thrill seekers who should have known better than to join in with Western customs like Halloween. Some of these critics even showed up at protests led by the victims' family, using loudspeakers to shout over their calls for more government support. And like the firefighters, some survivors, who were just teenagers at the time of the incident, also later died by their own hand. 16-year-old Lee Jae-hyun lost two of his best friends in the crush. He stopped talking afterwards, couldn't sleep, and ultimately took his own life 7 weeks after the disaster. In a video message, he asked his parents not to blame themselves, saying, "I wish that I would have parents like you in my next life." Now, it seems, Seoul is set on hosting its famous Halloween celebrations again. This time, though, it has put more safety measures in place. Starting in 2024, the government announced that it would set up a crowd monitoring system that uses CCTV and AI to alert police about potential crowd collapses. It's also said it would station 380 safety personnel in the district for Halloween celebrations going forward. But Itaewon has been a lot quieter around Halloween for the past couple of years. According to locals, the clubs and bars there still haven't regained their business since the crush. The owner of a bar called Lit Lounge, who goes by the name of, and I'm not joking, Pinnacle the Hustler, told the Korea Times, quote, "I believe that a return to Halloween in some form is in order for Itaewon. However, not enough time has passed for us to fully embrace the blood, guts and gore of the holiday." He says people there are still living in the shadow of the 2022 Halloween tragedy.